Why did the laughter sting more than the silence? That question circled in her mind even before the first mocking voice broke across the square. She stood there in full uniform, her boots locked, her rifle angled with practiced precision, her eyes fixed forward. It should have been another routine rotation, 20 minutes of motionless dignity before the next guard replaced her. She had rehearsed every inch of it, every breath, until it felt less like duty and more like penance. But tourists rarely understood penance. They understood spectacle, and today the air was heavy with their voices, thick with careless amusement. "Look at her, does she even blink?" one man chuckled. The others joined in, their laughter loud enough to echo against the old stone walls of the landmark she was sworn to guard. Phones lifted, shutters clicked. Each sound was a jab. Her jaw tightened. Her fingers curled slightly against the cool steel of her rifle. She did not move. She was not supposed to move. That was the law of the guard: silence, stillness, control. And yet inside her chest, something began to stir, a storm. The tourists pressed closer, leaning against the chain barrier as if rules were only suggestions. She heard sandals scrape on stone. She smelled sunscreen mixed with cigarette smoke. Their casualness was suffocating, like they had walked into a sacred place without removing their shoes. Then it happened. One man, a tall figure with a mocking grin, stepped forward, just a single step. His sneaker crossed the invisible line between respect and intrusion. He raised his phone higher, almost daring her. "Come on," he laughed, "do something." The words landed like a strike to the chest. Do something. Her muscles moved before her mind gave permission. In one sharp train motion, the butt of her rifle swung down, striking the ground with a crack that tore through the laughter like lightning splitting the air. The sound echoed, sharp and final. The tourists froze. The man stumbled back, phone lowering, his smirk vanishing into silence. And for the first time that day, the square was quiet. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, but outwardly she remained motionless. The rifle returned to its place, eyes straight, shoulders squared, nothing more. But the silence that followed was heavy. It pressed in on her, demanding explanation. Not from the tourists, they were already backing away, whispering, their laughter swallowed by unease, but from herself. Why had she done it? Why now? Why this man, this moment? The answer was buried deep, too deep. It wasn't about him. Not really. It was about a night years before when silence had cost more than dignity, when stillness had been mistaken for discipline and hesitation had turned into regret. She could still see the convoy in her mind, dust rising, headlights cutting through darkness, the sudden burst of fire from the hills. She had been frozen then, too, watching, waiting. Her orders had been to hold until the signal. She had held too long. And by the time she acted, the signal never came. A friend had been in that convoy, someone who trusted her to cover the flank, someone who never came back. So when the tourist stepped forward today, laughing, daring her, she had felt the echo, not of him but of that night, of silence that demanded action. Now, as the crowd slowly dispersed, she could feel the weight of stares. Some whispered that she had overreacted. Others admired the discipline it must take to stay so rigid even in anger. None of them knew the truth. None of them ever would. When her shift ended, she walked back to the barracks with boots clicking softly on stone. Her fellow guards didn't speak. They didn't need to. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes, brushed her arm lightly as he passed, a small gesture of understanding. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. Inside her quarters, the silence was unbearable. She unbuckled her rifle, laid it on the bed, and sat down. Her hands trembled, not with fear but with the residue of choice. Had she done it for the uniform, for the honor of the guard, or had she done it for herself, for that lingering ghost who still haunted her nights? She tried to sleep, but her body refused. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the laughter again, blending with the roar of gunfire from years before. And then the face of her friend, the one she hadn't saved. The barracks were quiet except for the ticking of a clock somewhere down the hall. She rose, packing, each step a whisper on the wooden floor. She thought of writing her report, trimming the edges of truth to make it neat. But something inside her rebelled. She had hidden enough already. So when she sat down at the desk and began to write, she told it plain. I acted because silence has a cost. She paused, pen hovering over the page. Should she add more? Should she admit what had driven her to act? The convoy, the night, the friend whose absence still hollowed her out. No, that part wasn't for the report. That part wasn't for anyone but her. The following day, the review board summoned her. A long room, fluorescent lights, officers with papers stacked neatly in front of them. They asked their questions in clipped voices. Why did you break protocol? Why did you move against the crowd? She met their eyes one by one and said only, because it was time. The words landed in the room like stones sinking in water. No one spoke for a moment. Then the questions resumed, circling her like vultures, trying to pin down the logic of her choice. But she offered nothing more, not because she was defiant, but because she knew they wouldn't understand. This wasn't about a tourist. This wasn't about a protocol. This was about carrying a silence too long, a silence that had already taken more than it had ever given. When they dismissed her, she stepped outside into the sunlight, breathing air that felt heavier than before. Her boots carried her back to the square, back to the chain, back to her post. And when she stood there again, rifle angled, eyes straight, she felt something settle inside her. Not peace, not pride, but something quieter, a kind of fragile redemption. Because dignity wasn't always about silence, and silence wasn't always strength. The crowd gathered again, though this time they kept their distance. Phones lifted, but no one laughed. No one dared. She heard murmurs, the rustle of maps, the shuffle of feet. But beneath it all there was respect, raw and unspoken. She held her position. The minutes ticked by. Stillness returned. But she knew deep inside that it was different now. The silence wasn't pressing her down anymore. She wasn't carrying it as punishment. She was holding it like a shield. And for the first time in years, the silence felt like hers. How many hours can a person stand before the silence begins to break them? That question hung in her chest as the square quieted again. The laughter of tourists was gone, replaced by the steady hum of the city beyond the walls, the distant grind of traffic, the clatter of wheels on cobblestone. She stood tall, rifle steady, but inside her, the storm hadn't settled. Tourists came and went, respectful now, their steps cautious, their voices hushed. They didn't look at her with mockery anymore. They looked with something closer to reverence. But reverence felt as heavy as ridicule. Both were forms of attention she didn't want. What she wanted was stillness, inside, not just outside. The shift ended and she walked back with her unit. A small platoon of ceremonial guards, men and women who knew the unspoken language of posture, silence, ritual. None of them spoke about what had happened the day before. They didn't need to. Silence was their language, but silence was also her enemy. That night in the dim barracks, the same soldier who had brushed her arm earlier finally spoke. He was older, his hair flecked with gray, his voice carrying the weight of years. You did what everyone here has wanted to do at least once, he said quietly, leaning on the doorframe of her quarters. She looked up from the cot where she sat polishing her rifle. That doesn't make it right. He shrugged. Right isn't always the point. She studied him, trying to read if there was judgment in his words. But his eyes were tired, kind, almost fatherly. A man who had seen too much and carried it quietly. You were military before this, he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Everyone here had been something before. She hesitated. She never liked to answer that one. Her file said enough. But tonight, something in his tone made her nod. Special operations. He let out a soft whistle. That explains it. Most of us came from infantry, a few from air units. Not many from your side of things." She didn't correct him. He didn't know the half of it. And maybe it was the dimness of the room or the quiet between them, but she found herself saying more than usual. "I thought this would be different, quieter, safe." His brow furrowed. "Is it?" She looked at her hands, at the way they trembled slightly when they stilled too long. "Sometimes." He didn't push. He just nodded, then turned to leave. But before he stepped out, he said something that lingered. "You're not the only one here who's running from something." The door closed and the silence returned. Sleep didn't come easy. Again her mind slipped backward to the convoy, to the night sky, to the ambush. She had been perched high on a ridge, watching through night vision, every detail sharp and green. She had seen the shadows moving before the others did. She had known, but orders had been clear. Wait for the signal. She waited. And in that wait, lives were taken. Her friend's voice came back to her, almost audible in the barracks darkness. "If something feels wrong, you don't wait, you move." She hadn't moved. The guilt burned like a coal she could never put out. The next morning her routine began again. Wake at dawn, dress in silence, march to the square, take position. But something about the way the crowd watched her had shifted permanently. There was a distance now, a space carved out by respect or fear, she couldn't tell which. Children stared with wide eyes. Parents hushed them. Cameras still flashed, but without laughter behind them. It was as if her one strike had redrawn the rules of the square. And yet inside, the storm didn't ease. At noon, when they rotated positions, she stepped back into the cool shade of the barracks wall. A younger guard, barely 20, approached her hesitantly. "Ma'am," he said softly, "is it true that you—" He didn't finish the question. She didn't answer. She just looked at him long enough that he lowered his eyes. But before he left, she said quietly, "Never mistake silence for weakness." The words surprised even her. They sounded like something her friend would have said. The day passed, the crowd shifted, evening fell. And still the question gnawed. Had she acted out of duty, or had she acted because her past refused to stay buried? That night the review board's decision came down. She was summoned again, papers spread before them, expressions stiff. "You broke protocol," one officer said flatly, "but you maintained control. Your record suggests discipline under pressure. Still, we cannot ignore." She interrupted, her voice steady but quiet. "You think this is about protocol, it's not." The room stilled. The officers exchanged glances. "Then what is it about, Sergeant?" She held her breath. The words threatened to rise. The convoy, the silence, the friend who died. But she swallowed them back. Some truths belong to the dead, not the living. Instead, she said, "It's about dignity, mine, yours, everyone who wears this uniform." The board stared at her, weighing her words. Finally, the senior officer leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "We'll consider this resolved. But remember, Sergeant, one more step out of line and this post will not protect you." She saluted, turned, and walked out without a word. Outside, the night air was cool, almost forgiving. She breathed deeply, letting it wash over her. But forgiveness wasn't for her, not yet. The older soldier, the one with gray in his hair, found her later, sitting on the steps outside the barracks. "They let you off easy," he said. She didn't answer. "You know," he continued, lowering himself to sit beside her, "my first year here, I nearly snapped too. A kid kept shouting at me, trying to make me flinch. I didn't move, thought I was strong. But that night I dreamed of his face for weeks. Sometimes action's easier than silence. Silence eats at you." She turned to look at him. "What did you do about it?" He smiled faintly. "I stayed. I learned to live with the silence. But I also learned it doesn't heal you. You have to choose something more than silence." She wanted to ask what that was, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she sat in silence beside him, the weight of his presence a strange comfort. When she finally rose to leave, he said one last thing. "You're not broken, you're waiting. There's a difference." His words followed her back to her quarters, echoing softly, stubbornly. Not broken, waiting. That night, for the first time, she let herself cry. Not loudly, not violently, just quiet tears slipping down her face in the dark. Not for the tourist, not for the bored, but for the friend she still couldn't name aloud. Because deep down, she knew the truth. The rifle strike yesterday hadn't been about defending honor. It had been about breaking her own silence, a silence that had been killing her for years. The square would wait, the crowds would come, the laughter might return, but now something inside her had shifted. She wasn't just standing guard over stone walls anymore. She was standing guard over her own fragile chance at redemption. And that was a battle no crowd could see. Why did the sound of boots on stone suddenly make her heart race? The square was calm that morning, the early light still soft, the crowd thinner than usual. Yet with each step she took toward her position, she felt as though the ground itself carried echoes of another place, another time. A dirt road, a convoy, the rumble of engines beneath a sky that promised violence. She shook the thought away, forcing her breath into rhythm, forcing her body back into ritual. Rifle angled, shoulders set, eyes forward. The tourists arrived in their steady trickle, families clutching maps, couples with cameras, schoolchildren whispering behind their hands. They watched her, but she didn't watch them. She couldn't. Because every time she let her eyes wander, she saw something else. Smoke, fire, the shadow of a friend lost. She blinked it away, focusing on the square, on the chain barrier that marked the sacred line. It was safe here, predictable, controlled, but safety was a fragile thing. By midday the sun was harsh and sweat gathered beneath her collar. The crowd grew thicker, voices swelled. Yet in the sea of sound she caught one detail, a laugh, sharp and careless, cutting across the square. It wasn't directed at her, not this time, but the sound hooked into her chest like a barb. She couldn't stop the memory that surged forward. It was a laugh she'd heard years ago, right before the ambush. A friend joking over comms, light-hearted, trying to ease the tension of the convoy crawl. A laugh that had been silenced moments later by gunfire. Her throat tightened. Her hands gripped the rifle harder than regulation demanded. She fought to stay still, but inside she was unraveling. When her shift finally ended, she walked back with the unit, but her pace lagged. The others noticed, though none of them spoke. Only the older soldier, the one with gray in his hair, caught her eye, a silent question hanging there. She didn't answer it. Not yet. That night sleep refused her again. The flashbacks were sharper now, less like memories and more like intrusions. She was back on that ridge, night vision painting the world green, the convoy moving slow and steady below. She saw the shadows in the hills, knew what they meant, felt the urge to act. But the order had been clear. Wait. So she had waited. The first explosion lit the night like a sunrise. Screams filled her headset. The laugh was gone, replaced by static and panic. She had moved then, too late, too desperate, firing into shadows that had already done their work. Her friend's voice never came back on the line. She sat upright in her cot, breathing hard, sweat running down her back. The barracks was silent around her, but her head was filled with noise. She rose, packing the narrow floor. Her hand brushed against the rifle leaning in the corner. She stared at it, remembering how heavy it had felt that night, how useless. The door creaked open. She turned, startled, to see the younger guard, the boy barely 20, standing there awkwardly. "Couldn't sleep," he said softly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Figured maybe you couldn't either." She said nothing at first, just studied him. His eyes were too wide, too unscarred. He reminded her of herself once, before the convoy, before the silence. "What do you see when you stand out there?" he asked suddenly. "Because I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. Proud, I guess. But mostly I just feel empty." His honesty disarmed her. She considered lying, giving him the answer the manuals would approve of. But instead she said, "Sometimes I see ghosts." He frowned. "Ghosts?" She nodded, her voice low. People I couldn't save, choices I didn't make. The square is quiet, but inside me it is. Not ever. The boy swallowed, his throat working. Does it get easier? She almost said yes, but she couldn't. Instead, she said, you learn to carry it, that's all. He didn't reply. He just nodded, his eyes darker than before, and left her alone again. When morning came, she felt different. Not lighter, but less alone. The boy's words had stirred something. If even he felt emptiness standing there, maybe silence was a universal battle. Maybe she wasn't as singularly broken as she thought. Later that day, the older soldier joined her on the steps, lighting a cigarette he wasn't supposed to have. He didn't offer her one, just smoked in silence. You keep staring at nothing, he finally said, but I know it's not nothing. She exhaled slowly. You ever lose someone because you waited too long? His eyes shifted, narrowing. Yeah, more than once. She turned to him. And how do you live with it? He flicked ash onto the stone, watching it scatter. By remembering that waiting is human, but acting when it matters, that's what makes us soldiers. We don't always get it right, but the ones we lost, they tell us to keep moving. His words hit her harder than she expected. Keep moving. That had been her friend's mantra too. Always moving, never still. And yet here she was, in a post built on stillness. The irony cut deep. That night she wrote in her journal, a habit she rarely indulged. The words came haltingly at first, then poured out. I stood silent when I should have acted. Now I act when I should be silent. I don't know which is worse, but I know one thing, silence is not neutral, it chooses for you. She closed the journal, her hand trembling. The next day, a new kind of test arrived. The crowd was larger than usual, buzzing with energy. A group of young men, loud, careless, pushed to the front. They jeered, not unlike the man she had silenced with her rifle strike. But this time they didn't just laugh. One of them leaned over the chain, spitting words in a language she didn't fully know, but the tone was universal. Mockery. Her pulse quickened. The storm inside surged again, demanding action. But she remembered the board's warning. One more misstep and her post would be gone. She froze. The jeers grew louder. One of the men made a mocking salute, grinning. The crowd watched, waiting, the air electric with tension. She could feel every muscle in her body screaming to move, to end this, to prove that silence wasn't weakness. But then, faintly, she heard her friends laugh. Not the mocking laugh of the crowd, but the warm, easy one from years ago. The memory pulled her back, steadied her. This time she didn't move. The crowd eventually shifted, the men losing interest, the moment dissolving into noise. She stood still, silent, unbroken. But as the shift ended, she walked away shaking. Was this strength or cowardice? She didn't know. All she knew was that the war between silence and action had started again, and it was far from over. Why did the silence feel heavier than the gunfire? That was the thought pressing against her skull as Evelyn stood at the edge of the compound wall, her breath misting in the chill desert night. She had expected noise, chaos, the roar of 100 angry voices, but instead there was stillness. A stillness that felt unnatural, almost wrong. Her finger hovered near the trigger of her rifle, though she had not raised it. Every nerve inside her screamed that something was about to shift, but she didn't know what. Behind her, the compound was dimly lit by a few flickering lanterns. The tourists, huddled in confusion and fear, whispered in scattered tones. Some tried to reassure one another. Some prayed. Some simply stared at the ground, waiting for fate to decide what came next. She inhaled deeply. The scent of dust, sweat, and faint smoke filled her lungs. That silence, it wasn't safety. It was a signal, a warning. And Evelyn had lived long enough to know that silence in a war zone was the loudest sound of all. But what would she do if the storm broke? Her mind flashed back to an earlier silence. Years ago, a hospital waiting room, her boots still muddy from the field. She had stood motionless under fluorescent lights, clutching a folded letter in her hand. Her younger brother, the one who used to beg her to tell him stories of bravery, had been inside, fighting for his life after an accident. She hadn't made it back in time. She had missed the moment to say goodbye. The silence of that room haunted her more than any battlefield. Now, standing at the compound wall, she felt that same ache, that same regret. And she wondered, if she failed here, if she faltered, how many families would be left with their own waiting room silence. The crunch of footsteps behind her pulled her back. It was Malik, one of the local guards who had been assigned to her detail. His eyes were tired, his uniform dust-stained, but his presence carried a strange steadiness. "They're watching," he whispered. His accent was thick but his words clear. "From the ridge." Evelyn followed his gaze. The ridge line beyond the village loomed dark against the star-filled sky. She squinted, adjusting her sight. At first, nothing. Then a faint shimmer of metal catching starlight. Movement. Shadows. Her pulse quickened. They weren't gone. They were circling. "What do they want?" Malik asked softly, almost to himself. Evelyn didn't answer right away, because deep down she feared the answer. They didn't want negotiation. They didn't want compromise. They wanted to make a point, a spectacle, and the tourists, terrified and vulnerable, were the perfect stage. She tightened her grip on her weapon, but a weapon couldn't solve what gnawed at her chest. The harder question was, how far was she willing to go? And if she chose action, what would it cost her? A ripple of murmurs rose from inside the compound. Evelyn turned slightly, catching sight of a woman clutching a young girl, maybe 8 years old. The girl's wide eyes caught hers for just a moment. No words were exchanged. No sound. Just that silent plea, a child looking at a soldier, asking without asking, "Will you keep us safe?" Her throat tightened. That look was enough to anchor her. Suddenly a crack split the silence. Not a gunshot, a rock tumbling down the ridge, then another. Movement grew more visible, shadows spreading out. They were testing the edge. Her training told her to wait. Hold fire. Confirm targets. Don't reveal your position too early. But her instincts, those raw human instincts that had saved her more times than rules ever had, told her that waiting might cost them everything. Malik shifted uneasily beside her. "Orders?" he asked. Evelyn's jaw clenched. She wasn't sure anymore if her decisions counted as orders. Not in this place. Not with these odds. But she knew one thing: indecision was deadlier than any bullet. She took a step forward, her boots sinking slightly in the sand. Her mind replayed every mistake, every hesitation that had ever left scars on her conscience. She couldn't bear to add one more. Not tonight. Then a sound she hadn't expected, a faint laugh. Not from the ridge, but from within the compound. A group of tourists, perhaps too nervous to understand the danger, had begun chuckling nervously, almost mocking the tension. The laughter carried into the night air, too loud, too careless. Evelyn's stomach dropped. The shadows on the ridge froze. The laughter had betrayed their fear, their presence. The enemy now knew this was no fortress. This was a cage full of unarmed, frightened souls. Her heart pounded. The choice was no longer a question. It was an ultimatum. Her voice cut through the night, low but sharp. "Get them quiet now." Malik moved quickly, gesturing, shushing, urging silence. The laughter died down, but the damage was done. Movement on the ridge grew bolder. Evelyn raised her weapon, her breath steady now. Her decision had crystallized. If they came closer, she would act. She would not wait for permission. Not this time. Because sometimes silence was not protection. Sometimes silence was surrender, and Evelyn had surrendered too many times before. She exhaled slowly, the weight of memory pressing against her ribs. If tonight demanded action, then action was the only language she would speak. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this moment, this fragile intersection of silence and choice, would mark everything that followed. And in the years to come, it would not be the laughter of the tourists or the shouts of the enemy she remembered most. It would be the silence, broken by the first shot she chose to take. Why did the first shot feel like betrayal? The moment the crack of her rifle echoed across the compound, Evelyn's chest clenched so tight it felt as if the air itself refused to let her breathe. The bullet struck the sand inches from where the shadow had been moving. She hadn't aimed to kill. Not yet. But the sound had shattered the fragile silence, announcing one truth that no one could ignore anymore. She had chosen action. The compound erupted. Tourists gasped, some screamed. The girl with the wide eyes buried her face into her mother's arms. Malik's jaw dropped, his eyes darting to Evelyn as if to ask, was that permission, or was that war? She kept her rifle raised, her body still as stone, but inside she was trembling. Not from fear of the ridge, but from fear of herself, because she knew what came after the first shot. The line had been crossed. There was no way to step back over it. The ridge answered in kind. A flash. Then the sharp report of return fire. Bullets tore into the compound wall, splinters of stone bursting like fireworks in the lantern light. The crowd ducked, people falling to the ground in panic. The night that had been suffocating in silence was now alive with violence. Evelyn forced herself to breathe, her training pulling her body into motion. She adjusted her scope, scanned the ridge. A silhouette broke from cover, sprinting lower down. Without hesitation, she fired again. This time she didn't miss. The shadow crumpled, motionless against the sand. Her pulse hammered. She told herself it was necessary. She told herself it was survival. But a whisper in the back of her mind still asked, had she just chosen death over dignity? Malik crawled toward her position, dust clinging to his sweat-streaked face. "They'll come harder now," he hissed. "They'll test us." She didn't need him to tell her. She already knew. Behind them, one of the tourists, a middle-aged man with trembling hands, stumbled forward. His voice cracked as he tried to sound brave. We can talk to them, can't we? Maybe they just want money, or..." Evelyn cut him off, her tone sharper than she intended. "Money doesn't stop bullets, get back." The man froze, shame painting his face, and retreated into the crowd. Evelyn hated how harsh she'd sounded, but there was no room for softness now, not when every second counted. Still, the question lingered inside her. Could she have tried words one more time? Was there still a chance, even now, to stop this spiral before it consumed them all? Her father's voice came back to her from years ago, sitting on the back porch after her first deployment. He had been a quiet man, rarely offering advice, but that night he'd said something she never forgot. "Sometimes, Eve, silence is mercy. Sometimes it's cowardice. The hard part is knowing which one you're living." She whispered those words now, almost to herself. Which one is this? Another burst of fire from the ridge snapped her back. Malik returned fire, his shots wild but enough to pin down the advancing shadows. Evelyn steadied her breath, waiting for the next target. Then something unexpected, a voice. Distant, carried faintly across the wind, not angry, not mocking, a command. She couldn't make out the words, but she knew the tone. Someone on the ridge was giving orders. They weren't a mob. They weren't improvising. They were coordinated. That changed everything. Her mind raced. If they were organized, then the tourists weren't random victims. They were pawns. This wasn't about money or territory. It was about demonstration, a message to whoever was watching or whoever would hear about it later. And that meant talking would never work, because words couldn't unmake a message already written in blood. She lowered her rifle for a breath, pressing her forehead against the cool stone of the wall. She wanted to cry, just for a second, not because she was afraid, but because she knew what she had to do next. If action was the only language the enemy would understand, then she would have to speak it louder than they ever expected. But how long could she carry that weight before it crushed her? A hand touched her shoulder. Malik again. His voice was quieter this time, almost human, almost vulnerable. "My brother, he was taken once. Years ago, they never brought him back. I can't let it happen again. Not here." Evelyn looked into his eyes. In that moment, she saw not just a fellow guard, not just an ally, but a man broken by memory, still standing because there was no other choice. His pain mirrored hers. His silence carried the same ghosts. She nodded once firm, then we don't let them take anyone. Another scream from the compound. A bullet had slipped through a crack, grazing a man's leg. Blood pooled quickly. Evelyn rushed over, pressing a strip of cloth against the wound. The man whimpered, clutching her arm. "Why you?" he gasped. "Why do you get to decide if we live?" Her hands froze. She wanted to say she didn't want this role, that she hadn't asked for it, that she'd give anything to be anywhere else. But all she said softly was, "Because if I don't, no one will." The man's breathing slowed, his grip loosening. Her words weren't comfort. They were truth, and sometimes truth was colder than any bullet. Night deepened, the ridge alive with shadows and fire. Evelyn's body moved on instinct: shoot, reload, reposition, protect. But her mind was somewhere else, on that hospital waiting room, on her brother, on her father's words, and on the question she couldn't silence. When the dawn came, would she be remembered as the woman who saved them, or the soldier who brought the fight down on them? The answer was still unwritten. But with every trigger pull, every scream, every silence that followed, the ink was drying faster than she wanted. And as the ridge grew darker with figures closing in, Evelyn realized something that chilled her more than any bullet. The laughter that had betrayed them earlier, that hadn't been the worst mistake. The worst mistake was believing silence could ever protect them in the first place. What happens to a soldier when the night refuses to end? Evelyn asked herself that as she reloaded in the dark, her fingers trembling more from exhaustion than fear. Hours had passed since the first shot, yet the ridge still crawled with shadows. Every time she thought the silence had returned, a burst of fire came from the rocks, forcing her back into the rhythm of survival. Her body moved, but her mind drifted. The ache in her shoulders reminded her of training fields years ago, when she was just a cadet, before the medals, before the ghosts. She remembered the voice of her instructor barking through the dusk. The battle doesn't end when the shooting stops. It ends when you can still look at yourself in the mirror. Would she be able to look at herself when this was over? A faint glow crept at the horizon, soft pink against the endless desert. Dawn was coming. But dawn didn't mean safety. It meant exposure. If the attackers pressed during daylight, the compound's weak walls would crumble under sheer force. Malik slumped beside her, sweat running down his neck. His breathing was heavy, his rifle barrel blackened with smoke. They'll try again before the sun rises. That's when men are weakest, when they've been fighting shadows all night. Evelyn nodded, her lips dry. Then we don't give them the chance. But how? She had only a handful of guards, a crowd of civilians who couldn't fight, and her own weary determination. Action had carried them through the night, but action alone would not carry them through the day. From the far corner of the compound, a cry rang out. The young girl, the one with the wide eyes, was shivering violently in her mother's arms. The mother called out, desperate. Evelyn rushed over, kneeling down. The girl wasn't wounded, just terrified, terrified beyond what words could soothe. Evelyn reached out, brushing the child's trembling hands with her own. "SHH," she whispered, though she knew the sound was hollow against the chaos outside. Still, she held the girl's gaze, steady, unblinking. "You're safe with me." The child stared back, searching for truth in her eyes. And in that silent exchange, Evelyn made a vow to herself, to the girl, to everyone here. She would not break again. She would not let silence take another soul. She stood, the vow solidifying in her chest. Action wasn't enough anymore. She needed a plan. Her eyes drifted toward the old signal tower at the edge of the compound. It hadn't worked in years, the wires cut, the panels rusted. But maybe there was something left in it. A symbol, if not a lifeline. "Malik," she said firmly, "we need that tower lit before dawn. Even if it doesn't reach command, someone out there will see it. Someone will know we fought." Malik hesitated. That tower is exposed. They'll see us climbing. It's suicide. Her jaw tightened. Then I'll climb. The silence between them stretched. Finally, Malik exhaled. You're not climbing alone. They prepared quickly. She left her rifle slung across her back, taking only what she could carry up the ladder. The tourists watched, their faces pale in the lantern light, as if they were witnessing something they could not quite name, hope, perhaps, or madness. The climb was harder than she expected. The metal rungs cut into her palms, the tower groaning under her weight. With each step, the ridge loomed clearer, the enemy silhouettes shifting, preparing. She felt their eyes on her, like 1,000 unspoken threats carried by the wind. Halfway up, a shot rang out. The tower shuddered as a bullet struck the beam beside her. Evelyn froze, her breath ragged. She should climb down. She should seek cover. But then she remembered her brother, remembered the silence of that hospital waiting room. She remembered the girl's trembling hands, and she forced her legs to move. Step, step, step. At the top, the wind was sharp and cold. She pulled at the rusted wires, sparks spitting weakly. The system was nearly dead. She cursed under her breath, working faster, her fingers raw. Malik climbed up behind her, offering tools, his face grim with determination. Another shot. This one grazed the metal near her feet. Time was running out. She twisted one last wire, pressed a switch, and the tower sputtered to life. A flare of light flickered weakly, then steadied into a pale but visible glow against the dark sky. Not strong, not powerful, but undeniable. The ridge erupted with noise. The attackers knew what it meant. Their chance at secrecy was gone. Bullets tore through the air, the tower rattling violently. Malik shouted for her to climb down, but Evelyn didn't move. She stared at that faint glow, her chest swelling with something she hadn't felt in years, defiance. Even if no one came, even if they all fell here, that light was proof they hadn't been silent. They climbed down under fire, ducking as rounds splintered the beams. Reaching the ground, Malik grabbed her arm. You've just painted a target on us. Evelyn met his eyes, her voice steady. Better a target than forgotten. Back inside the compound, the crowd stirred, murmurs rising. Some pointed at the glow of the tower, faint but steady. Their fear didn't vanish, but something shifted. They no longer looked only at the ridge. Some looked at her. The attack came harder then. Waves of gunfire, shouting in a language she didn't understand. Shadows pressed closer, their outlines clearer as dawn threatened the horizon. The compound walls shook under the assault. Evelyn fired, reloaded, fired again. Malik stood beside her, relentless. The tourists huddled close, whispering prayers. In the chaos, Evelyn felt something strange. A calmness deep and steady beneath the roar of battle. She realized it wasn't about winning. It wasn't about survival. It was about standing, about being the line no one else would draw. She didn't know if the light from the tower would reach anyone. She didn't know if the dawn would bring relief or ruin. But she knew one thing with certainty. When silence demanded surrender, she had chosen to act. And that choice, whatever it cost, was already echoing louder than any words ever could. How long could a wall hold against the weight of a storm? Evelyn asked herself that as the first slivers of sun burned across the desert horizon. The night had broken, but with daylight came no mercy, only exposure. The ridge that had once been a mass of shifting shadows was now sharp with figures, armed and determined, spilling down the slopes like a tide intent on swallowing the compound whole. The air smelled of dust and gunpowder. The walls groaned with each strike of bullets. Every stone felt thinner, weaker, as if one more push would shatter it completely. And behind those walls, the crowd of civilians clung to silence, terrified, trembling, watching their fate inch closer with each minute. Evelyn wiped sweat from her brow, her rifle heavy in her hands. She had been awake for too many hours, her body raw with fatigue, but her eyes burned with something fiercer than exhaustion, defiance. She had chosen action, and now action demanded its price. "Positions," she shouted, her voice hoarse. Malik echoed her command, rallying what few guards remained. They weren't soldiers, not really. Just men trying to hold back a flood with cracked shields and rusted rifles. But when their eyes met hers, she saw in them the same fire she felt inside. The first breach came quick. A crack in the wall near the east corner, where stones had already been loosened by the night's relentless fire. Dust spilled as a section crumbled, and through it surged 3 figures, rifles raised. Evelyn didn't think, she moved. Her shots were sharp, precise. 2 fell instantly, the third staggered and dropped his weapon. Malik finished him before he could recover. The breach was sealed with hurried hands and trembling stones, but the message was clear. The wall would not hold much longer. Inside the compound, fear rippled like a wave. The tourists huddled tighter, whispering frantic prayers. A man in his 50s broke from the crowd, eyes wild. "We can't stay here. We'll all die if we do." Evelyn turned, her gaze sharp. "If you run, you die faster. You want to make it through this. Stay behind the wall, trust us." The man faltered, tears streaking down his dirt-covered face. For a moment she saw something raw in him, not just fear but regret. A story she'd never hear, a life he might not live to finish. He nodded, retreating back into the group. Her chest ached. Every face here was a reminder, every scream, every sob a weight she carried on her shoulders. She could not save them all, she knew that, but she could stand. She could buy them minutes, maybe hours, maybe enough. The enemy pressed harder. Gunfire raked the walls, bullets snapping past her ears. Evelyn dropped to one knee, reloading with swift, practiced motions. Her hands shook, not from fear but from sheer exhaustion. She clenched her jaw, steadying them. Beside her, Malik grunted as a bullet grazed his arm, tearing through fabric and flesh. He stumbled, but Evelyn caught him, dragging him behind cover. His face twisted in pain, but his voice stayed steady. "Don't you dare stop now. Not after all this." She pressed cloth against his wound, blood seeping through her fingers. "You'll be fine," she lied. He smirked faintly, eyes closing for a second too long. "Liar." Her throat tightened, but she pushed him gently back against the wall. "Stay alive, that's an order." The walls shook again. Another breach. This one larger, stones tumbling into the compound, dust choking the air. Evelyn spun, rifle raised, as figures burst through. For a heartbeat, time slowed. She saw them, faces hard, eyes burning, weapons drawn. She saw the civilians behind her pressed against one another in terror. She saw the girl again, clutching her mother's hand, eyes wide, waiting for someone to save her. And she knew this was the line. If she fell here, if she hesitated, everything would collapse. Her body moved before thought. She fired, the recoil jolting her shoulder. One fell. Another. She lunged forward, slamming the butt of her rifle into the third before Malik, wounded but unbroken, finished him with a trembling shot. The breach closed in blood and stone. Silence followed, sharp and heavy. But it was not victory. It was only pause. The sun rose higher, spilling gold across the desert. In its light, Evelyn saw the truth. The ridge was still full. Dozens more waited, preparing, their voices rising in chants that echoed across the sand. The final push was coming. Her knees buckled for a moment, exhaustion nearly toppling her. She caught herself on the wall, closing her eyes. She thought of her brother again, of her father's words, of every silence that had haunted her life. And she whispered so softly no one could hear, "Not this time." Her eyes opened, sharp, alive. She turned to the crowd, her voice cutting through the heavy air. "Listen to me. This is not the end, not if we stand, not if we fight for every second. Do you hear me?" Some nodded, some wept. But for the first time she saw more than fear in their faces. She saw the faint spark of belief. Malik leaned against the wall, pale but grinning weakly. "You sound like you almost believe it yourself." Evelyn met his gaze steady. "I have to." Because belief was all they had left. The chants from the ridge grew louder. Footsteps thundered closer. The wall trembled under the weight of the storm pressing against it. Evelyn raised her rifle once more, the barrel glinting in the dawn light. She inhaled, steadying her breath. The final assault was coming, and she would meet it not with silence, not with surrender, but with the only thing left she could give: action. The battlefield had been reduced to fragments of memory and dust. Smoke drifted across the horizon like the shadows of things that no longer lived. The silence that followed the final barrage felt heavier than any sound, pressing down on hearts and bones, as if the earth itself remembered the weight of all that had transpired. Alara sat at the edge of the ruined village, her back against a crumbled wall. Her body bore the scars of the campaign, bandages stained with the proof of every moment she had stood against forces greater than herself. Yet her gaze did not falter. She looked across the field as if she could still see the echoes of her comrades moving, their laughter still lingering between the broken stones, their courage imprinted in the soil. The others began to gather around her, faces tired, uniforms torn, eyes rimmed with the shadows of sleepless nights. Some limped, some leaned on each other, but they all came. No one told them to, they just knew. Alara had become the center of a circle that no command, no hierarchy, no book of war could dictate. "Is it over?" one of the younger soldiers whispered, his voice unsteady, as if afraid the question itself would summon more fire. Alara didn't answer immediately. She looked at the eastern sky where faint traces of light were beginning to rise. "It's not over," she said softly, "but it's enough for now, enough to breathe, enough to remember why we fought." Her words were not meant to inspire. They were not polished or sharpened for speeches. They were simple, raw, spoken by someone who had carried the weight of every heartbeat around her. And because of that, they carried farther than the finest oration could. The wounded were tended to, the fallen gathered with reverence. No one rushed. Each soldier who was laid to rest was given a silence so deep it felt eternal, and in that silence their presence became unbreakable. Alara walked among them, her hand brushing against each makeshift marker, her lips moving silently, not in prayer but in remembrance. As the last name was whispered, she stood still for a long while, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of a soldier who had carried others too far to ever put them down. One of the officers stepped forward. His uniform bore medals, but his face was weary, humbled. "They'll call this a victory," he said, voice low. "But what will you call it?" Alara turned her head slightly, her eyes steady on the field before them. "I'll call it a promise," she answered, "that we won't forget what it cost." Night gave way to morning. The light revealed not just destruction but resilience, the kind that only humans carried, the kind that turned ruins into foundations. Around the edges of the broken village, survivors had already begun to gather. Children peeked from behind walls, their eyes wide but unbroken. Women carried water to the wounded. Men began to clear rubble, their hands raw but relentless. The war had not taken their will. Alara rose and walked among them, her steps slow but deliberate. Some reached out to touch her sleeve, as though her presence itself offered a shield. Others simply nodded, silent acknowledgments of someone who had become more than a soldier to them. She was proof that they had endured and could endure still. When the summons finally came from command, it was almost an afterthought, a call to report, to debrief, to prepare for whatever was next. Alara listened quietly, then handed the device back to the messenger. "I'll come when they understand what truly matters," she said. "And what is that?" the messenger asked. "That war is never just numbers on a report. It's every face, every voice, every silence left behind." As dawn stretched fully across the horizon, Alara stood with her comrades one last time. They looked not at the ruins but at the horizon, where light grew brighter by the second. She spoke then, not loudly, not with the force of command, but with the clarity of truth. "We have carried the weight together. We have bled, we have broken, and yet we stand. This is not the end, but it is the proof that no matter the fire, no matter the storm, humanity does not vanish. We remain. Her words lingered in the air like a vow, binding them not to war, but to each other. The world beyond would tell their story in fragments, reports, rumors, half-remembered echoes. But here, among the ashes and the dawn, the truth was whole. Humanity had endured not because of one, but because of all who refused to fall. And so, as the first true rays of light bathed the land in gold, Alara closed her eyes, her breath steady, her heart unyielding. She was no longer just the soldier who had carried them through battle. She was the memory that would keep them alive. The battlefield was silent now, silent but not empty, because in the silence lived every promise they had made, every bond they had forged, and every life they had fought for. It was not an ending. It was the beginning of whatever humanity would build next. And above it all, the dawn rose,